Thank you. It's always a lot of pressure to be the last talk of the day because I know that everyone is thinking about beer. And so I will not try to keep, I don't want to be the one who stands too long between you and your drinks. But I do want to talk about this because it's been something that I've been thinking about for a long time. And that is this idea of what are we supposed to do about hate speech and the growing hate in my country and some other, I don't know so much about Ireland, in many of our countries, and online. Now, a lot of people would say, censor it, yeah? And I think that that's a valid response, but not necessarily a good solution. So I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about my feelings around this and where things are going right now, and also what we might be able to do to help combat hate. So as you know, I come from a free expression perspective. I work for the EFF. We've been fighting for rights online for a long time, and I'm from the US, where the First Amendment protects hate speech as well as other speech. So let's start by asking the question, what is hate speech? I'm sure everyone has their own answer, but what I think is really interesting about this question is just how many answers there are to it. We've got the United Nations, which says that the advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. It's got that key of inciting violence. Then we've got Facebook's definition, which I think is also interesting, content that directly attacks people based on a number of different categories. We've got the German definition, incitement to hatred against segments of the population, really specific, again, calls for violence or other measures against people, assaults against the human dignity of others, et cetera, et cetera. Ireland, where we are right now, I hope I got this one right. Prohibition of incitement, again, we've got that key. It hinges on the idea of incitement. But then again, once you go down, you've also got these other little bits, and then it's very vague. Stir up hatred, what does that mean? And then, of course, the United States, where we have no laws against hate speech, and thus no proper definition of it either. Now, my takeaway from this is not that countries shouldn't have the right to do what they want. Of course, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights not only allows, but perhaps even requires countries to do something at the national level about hate speech. So I'm not saying that countries have no right to their own sovereignty or that we shouldn't be doing it. What I'm questioning here is the effectiveness of censorship in combating hate. So first, let's talk about the harm. And I want to talk about both the harm of hate speech, which I think is something that everyone here knows something about, and also the harm of censorship in the context of hate speech. So first, that first question, what is the harm of hate speech? Now, again, I think that there are a lot of different answers to this question. I'm going to use this one example. This is an image from a New York Times article that was about a report done between 2004 and 2013 of Google searches. And what this report found was that there was a direct correlation geographically between anti-Muslim searches and anti-Muslim hate crimes. And so what they did, the researchers, was measured this sentiment by using common searches that imply hateful attitudes toward that specific group. They looked for things like, are all Muslims terrorists, as a question, because it doesn't leave much to the imagination about what the searcher really thinks about Muslims. They're trying to find an example, a needle in the haystack that proves their existing idea wrong, and with that search, they're not going to find it. Because as we know, Google's results are you often get a lot of hateful content in the first search, particularly when it comes to this topic. And then when you look at searches that are even more clear, like I hate Muslims, the correlation grows. And so we know about the harms, and Muslims, of course, are not the only category of people who are affected by hate speech. I'm a woman on the internet. I see a lot of you in the room are probably also women on the internet. I'm guessing that you've experienced hate speech online as well. As Laurie Penny likes to say, a woman's opinion is the short skirt of the internet, which is to say, if you have an opinion, you're asking for the kind of harassment that you get. And yet, I'm still not convinced that censorship is the answer. I do just want to highlight this project as well. I think that this is an excellent project, the Dangerous Speech Project. It tries to draw a line between hate speech, which is this, again, this vague, amorphous concept that can include lots of different things that can be politicized, and the idea of dangerous speech, speech that directly incites violence against a particular group. I encourage you to check it out, and I think that their FAQ is really interested in trying to draw that line between those two ideas, as well as the website offers a lot of different ways to counteract this kind of speech. Now, what are most governments and companies doing about hate speech right now? The answer is trying to wipe it from the public's view without doing a whole lot else. So we've got this in Germany, where Basically, Germany is trying to force social media companies to take down certain types of speech within a certain period of time or face consequences, usually financial penalties. The European Union's trying to do the same thing, and it's not long before other governments try to as well. We've already heard in the past few weeks about even Iran approached Silicon Valley tech companies to see if they could pull back certain content. We've also seen Israel talking to companies about this, and again, the more Western governments that do it typically, the more other governments will try the same thing. And so, okay, fair enough. I understand that the legal context here is that a government has laws that exist already against hate speech. But what happens when you then privatize that censorship and rely on a corporation to do it for you? This is what happens. So Facebook already has rules against hate speech. And those rules, as I showed at the beginning, are pretty clear. They talk about different categories of people and people that you cannot incite violence or say negative things about, basically. And Facebook already moderates that content. Now, how does that work typically? I assume most of you know, but I'll just give you the quick rundown because this is my area of expertise. Basically, when you're on Facebook or Twitter or any other platform like that, you can, or in fact, you're encouraged to report your friends when they do something that's against the rules. So if we're just in a group together and we're chatting and you say something, I don't know, anything, I can then click report, it goes into a moderation queue, and either an algorithm or a human looks at that piece of content and makes a decision as to where it goes. And I say either an algorithm or a human because it does vary by company, and we don't know much about how this works in practice. And so that decision is made quickly, and then the content is either taken down or the user themselves is taken down. And then after that, sometimes the user is able to appeal that decision, depending on the platform. Sometimes they're not. Now, what happens in practice is stuff like this. Now, I know that there are some non-native English speakers, so I'll just explain this just in case so nobody's left wondering. The word dyke is a word that lesbians have reclaimed over time to use for themselves. Now, if you use it against somebody, it is considered a slur, but if you use it about your own community, it's okay. And there's a lot of words like this, of course, I'm sure in many languages. In this case, though, Facebook was systematically censoring this word for a week at a time, to the point where one of their the members of their policy team actually ended up writing a blog post and making a statement about what was happening and how they're trying to understand the context. But the problem is that the people and the machines that make these decisions don't always have that kind of insight. If you looked at this, you might not understand what this person meant, and if you were a content moderator working in a country like India or the Philippines, you may not have this particular context of a way that this word is used in, let's say, the United States and the UK and other native English-speaking places. And so you end up with stuff like this. And like this is another example. Yoma Luo is a writer who experienced something really nasty. She shared a message that she had gotten from someone on Facebook that was really hateful, filled with racial slurs. She posted that person's message to Facebook and found herself censored for sharing the threat that she'd received. This happens so often that all of the major media publications in the US have done stories about it recently. There's one in the New York Times, one in the Washington Post, about different people. And it seems to happen a lot to women, because women are the ones who are receiving the vast majority of these types of threats and then sharing them, and often to people of color as well. And so there's a disproportionate effect because those people are the ones who are more likely to get threats in the first place. And then what about the content moderators themselves? What about the very fact that we, as people living in the global north, don't want to see this content, and so instead, companies are paying people really, really low wages, giving them very, very little training to make these decisions in buildings in countries far, far away from us? What about those people? What about the things that they have to look at all day? They suffer for it as well. A lot of them have actually reportedly struggled with PTSD, people who've worked as content moderators for big companies, because they're looking at things like beheading videos, they're looking at things like pornographic content, maybe even child pornographic content, but then they're also seeing all of this hate flowing through their screens every single day. And then, of course, What happens when it becomes political? What happens when the same rules that you wanted in place to protect you from this group then get used against your own group? Now, again, not everybody in this room necessarily supports this group, and that's fine. But nevertheless, this is the sort of thing that we're starting to see happen in the US right now, where amidst, we've had these protests. We had Charlottesville, where these white supremacists came out, these Nazis came out and rallied and killed someone, and then counter-protests where people and anti-fascists came out and argued against them, of course, right? So you've got these clashes, and then what you have is the political class and some of the right-wing media in the US saying that both sides are just as bad as each other because both sides engaged in some sort of violence at one time. So there's this flattening out of the speech, this equalization that says, oh, well, these people are calling for genocide, and these people want to punch these people, so both of them are bad. And that's what I'm really afraid of right now, is that as I start to hear more and more calls in my own country for the government or for companies to do something about hate speech, there's not a whole lot of consideration about what happens when those rules get used against you. And they do all the time, as I showed in those examples. And then what about with governments? Does anyone know who this is? I'm going to pronounce her name wrong if I don't look at it, and that would be very embarrassing for me. So this is Victoire Ingabire. And what's interesting about her case is that, well, she's in prison for hate speech that was something, I'll explain from the beginning. Basically, everyone's familiar with the Rwandan genocide. She's from an opposition political party, and what she did was she raised the question, raised the point, the fact that her group, Hutus, were also targeted by militias at that time. Now, I understand that this kind of is sometimes on the line, and the same kind of thing falls when we talk about things like Holocaust denial as well, questioning aspects of a genocide. But what she actually said was that my people were killed too. And now she's serving a 15-year prison sentence. And the reason that I bring this one up is that what I'm seeing in my own country right now is people calling for a hateful white supremacist government to censor hate speech. How do they not think that that's not going to be used, or sorry, how do they think that that's not going to be used against the very people that they're trying to support? And so what do we do instead? If we don't think that censorship is the right idea, what do we do? Now, let me just say this, because I understand right now that this is a really contentious issue and that some people are not really down with the idea of free speech for all. I'm going to speak personally for a second. I don't want this to be misconstrued, so I'm going to say that because I know that I'm on film. I don't really care on a very personal level if white supremacists get censored. What I care about is the effects of what happens when we put those systems in place. I understand some people feel, I'll fight for the right, I'll fight to the death for your right to say whatever, an often misquoted quote. But I don't feel that way. What I feel is that when we put systems in place, be they technological, legal, or whatever, to censor one kind of speech, they always, always, always have a trickle-down effect to other kinds of speech. And so we see this when we put filters in place, when governments have put filters in place in the past to deal with things like child sexual abuse imagery. You have legal pornography that always gets caught up in those filters. Now again, people might not care, what's a porn site, why does it matter? But those are people trying to make a business with legal content that gets swept up into filters that are meant to root out illegal content. The same thing is happening here. These rules that are meant to protect people from hateful speech are being used against people who are engaging in counter speech, who are engaging in awareness raising, who are talking about their communities and using words that their communities chose to reclaim. And yet those are the people on social media right now who seem to be impacted the most by these rules. We still see the hateful content in many cases, but this stuff goes away and we don't see it because it's disappeared from our view. So what should we do? I know that this is a complicated question. I know that I don't have every answer. But as this talk is called Loving Out Loud in a Time of Hate, I feel that we have to be loud. We have to speak up. We have to speak out against hate wherever we see it, and we have to build our communities up to be strong. And I understand that we're putting ourselves at great risk to do that. I'm going home to my country in a couple weeks, and I have no idea what's going to be waiting for me there. I'm a little terrified, and I'm a little terrified to put myself on the front line, but then I think about my friends who are even more impacted by this, and what are all of the things that I could possibly do to stand there and fortify so that they're not the ones getting harmed. So I think that we need to speak up, and we need to be out on the streets when this is happening. I really like this picture. I also think that love trumps hate. I think that a lot of times the anger that builds up and the anger in fighting back against hateful groups causes us to become angry too, causes us to become violent too. And I'm not saying that that's not justified in certain circumstances, but I know that for me, this has been a real struggle over the past year as I've seen all of the things that I love slowly taken away from me back home. And so to me, the really important point there is to remember love, that we have to remember that love trumps, I hate that word, but trumps hate. That we have to remember to be loving in our interactions, to share that, and to share our strategies with each other for how we're going to counter these groups. And then finally, I think that, again, we need to keep calm. Sorry, I thought I had one more slide and I didn't. I guess I accidentally deleted it right before I put it on the thing. I'm so sorry. The last thing that I was going to say before I was surprised by my own slides, sorry, was education. That I think that a lot of times right now, and especially in the context of the free expression argument, what's being said, especially back in the US, is that there's kind of, like I said, there's this equalization of speech. And there's this idea that free speech means not criticizing things, not standing up to them. I can't tell you, I mean, maybe this sounds really foreign to you, but I can't tell you how many times a day in the course of my work I come across people who think that standing up for free speech means standing up for the content of the speech itself. That really scares me that we've reached a point where there's so many people who have that understanding. And so people say to me, literally almost every day on the internet, how could you possibly be a free speech advocate if you're saying, fuck Nazis? Well, turns out you can. Turns out those two things are not mutually exclusive. And so I think that it is really important to educate people about what free expression really means. Yes, we may feel, maybe you don't, but I feel that we shouldn't put legal ramifications on people for their speech for a number of reasons. And I think that I've demonstrated some of those, and there are many others as well. But at the same time, I do think that we need to educate people about what free expression means, what it means to use our speech wisely, lovingly, and responsibly. So thank you very much. I don't want to stand between you and your beers any longer, but I am available for whatever questions you might have. Thanks.
Jillian, no, that's fine. So we have some time still for questions. Does anyone? Yeah, okay, I'll come with the mic. This way. Raise your hand again.
Hi, I'm Eugenia. Thank you, Jillian. That was very interesting. I have a question that perhaps slightly critical in a way. I am with you. I fear the ramifications of censorship, but I also feel that to think that no legislation for hate speech is not implementing a censorship of its own is something that we have to think about, that the effects of this unchecked hate speech has been to censor the voices of people that we need to hear.
Yes.
So it's not so much like, I think that this is something that certainly complicates the question of censorship, and also the lack of a system is always a system is on the other side. So there is something in place there, and that something that is in place there is censoring a particular particular groups of people that are also vulnerable in many other ways. So in fact, by not doing anything, we prioritize these people who are supporting the situation that we currently find ourselves in. This is a point I wanted to make, and well, anyway.
No, absolutely. And I think that that's actually, so a lot of my work is around how companies regulate speech. And I'm going to speak specifically to that because I don't do as much work personally on the legal side of things. And I understand there's so many different countries represented in this room, I guess, that I don't want to get so picky into the details there. But when it comes to companies and the way that they regulate speech, as you said, yeah, the systems are already in place. So then for me, what do we do rather than try to tear those down? Or, I mean, yes, we can build other platforms. We don't have to use Facebook, et cetera. But rather than tear all those rules down and start from the beginning, what's one thing that we could do to then, with those rules already in place, prevent them from doing even more harm like they're already doing? To that I would say, and I know that that's a little bit of a diversion from the question, but to that I would say, I think that we need to ensure that there are robust systems in place. So right now we have systems, but in this particular case, and I do agree with you, I just want to say that I do absolutely agree that speech can have the effect of silencing other people as well, and that's a really important thing to note. So for me, one of the things that's really important is making sure that those cases stop happening and that those people in those situations have the ability to appeal those decisions. And so what we need from companies is a more responsible approach to the censorship that they're already engaged in. Now again, my perfect world doesn't have censorship, but I understand your perspective, and I think that if we're going to not try to fight the companies and push them to just not have rules at all, which is, again, not going to be very effective, then what we need to do is make sure that their systems are more robust. We need to protect the workers, number one. These content moderators are getting paid incredibly low wages and not getting the kind of training and support systems that they need. Number two, I think that we need to make sure that every user has the ability to appeal these decisions so that the people who want to use the word dyke, the people who want to share the threats that they're receiving, all of those people are protected as well. And then I think also, frankly, that censorship by itself is ineffective. So even if we're okay with censorship, we can't decouple it from education. What these companies do is they take the content, they sweep it under the rug, pretend it never existed, but they're not really doing much to help users understand where they went wrong. And so in some cases, the users aren't doing anything wrong, and they're trying to understand, what happened here. But in some cases, you could potentially start pushing people in a different direction with a love-based approach. So I would like to see that happen. But I do take your point, absolutely.
Anyone else?
Hi, thank you. I'm Andrea.
Hi.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts or any ideas on a difference between hate speech that comes from so-called human bots, organized groups engaging in online propaganda, and the hate speech of genuinely hateful people who are doing it just because they're hateful, compared to those who are doing it for fun or money.
So sorry, I don't understand what you mean by human bots, though. Do you mean bots or people behaving like bots?
I'm talking about, so you mentioned Israel earlier during this Gaza siege in 2014, I think. Mm-hmm. They were organized classrooms at the University of Haifa, I think, in which the students were supporting the state by gathering on in those labs and having like social media campaigning. Now, I don't know, I'm not saying that that was hate speech or not, but in Russia, like the Russian trolls are also organizing in the same way, kind of functioning as an avalanche on this particular topic on Twitter at this time, at this moment, and then just destroying the debate.
Well, I think that we should treat it as what it is. It's state-sponsored propaganda in both cases. So so I'm familiar with the Israeli case as well as Russia, and then we also have, China's 50-cent army. I think there was a country in Africa as well that I'd only heard about recently that also has employed people in that sort of way. And so this is getting more and more common. More states are realizing that they can employ individuals to, meddle with foreign politics, meddle with local politics, or just generally engage in whatever. And sometimes it's hate, and sometimes it may not be. But nevertheless, I've written about this before. I'm fundamentally against this idea because I think that if, as a state, you need to employ people to sit in a room and engage in petty banter online, you've already lost. Like, you're pretty pathetic. So my message to states is that's so sad. But at the same time, how should companies do that? How should they handle that kind of situation? I think that's really difficult, right? So right now you've got Twitter. This is the story just last week where Twitter was able to, thanks to some researchers, sort of identify certain Russian bots and then take them down en masse. Am I against that? No, not really. At the same time, that same sort of thing has been employed by Twitter to go after extremist accounts. Last year, or 2 years ago maybe, they announced that they'd taken down like 235,000 accounts supporting extremism, but they gave no criteria, none of the criteria which they used to determine what was support for extremism. So that's pretty concerning. And once I started looking into it, it was actually really hard to find somebody who'd been wrongly censored by that. But I was able to find somebody, and they had been mocking a terrorist group in the Arabic language. So Twitter didn't do a very good job of identifying what was parody and what was not parody. And so that's what concerns me, is how do you identify those, human bots? I like the term. How do you identify them? How do you ensure that they are who they purport to, or that they are bots? And then what do you do with them?
No more questions? Okay, so Jillian, I was just wondering then, do you have any, I know you mentioned, I forgot the name of the platform that you mentioned in your presentation.
The Dangerous Speech Project?
Exactly, yeah. I was just wondering, just to wrap up, do you have any other platforms or groups that you would recommend that if people want to look up and see they are doing something?
Yes, and actually I meant to put the URL up, and then it was really long, and then I ran out of time. But the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a US organization, so some of this is going to be really US-focused content, but this particular thing that they just put out, they've just published these 10 steps to fighting hate in your community, and it's explicitly without censorship. And so it has a bunch of different ideas behind it. They're the experts. Again, I'm not. But I think it's a really great resource. And so Southern Poverty Law Center, check them out.
Okay, that's your last chance for one more question. If anyone had any question popping up in the last second. And if not, we'll wrap. Thank you so much, Jillian. And and we are going to jump straight on to our closing of Republica.